Right. We'll see if I can get chapters 29 and 30 together. I don't know. It might be a little bit too much, but we'll see. That'll set you up for quiz 5 if we can get through both of them. Let's do a quick review. Walk down memory lane a bit. Yeah, the title is correct. The Turbulent 60s. A lot going on. So as we move into that era, you've got this bipolar world that's developed in the Cold War with the Soviets and us. So the Truman Doctrine's a response to it. It doesn't use the word communist or the Soviet Union, but it basically says the U.S. is going to help anybody resisting communist influences. So that sets the stage, and the doctrine is based on containment. And what happens is about 4 years after the end of World War II, the Soviets do develop a nuclear weapon, and that changes the world dynamic because during the Berlin airlift, we're flying airplanes in and out of Berlin to keep the city alive, and the Soviets had every opportunity to shoot down those aircraft, but they didn't because we were the only game in town with nukes at that point. But by 1949, they're part of the nuclear club, one of 2 now, and that precipitates the development of National Security Council Paper 68, which spells out how we're going to fight the Cold War. And it basically describes communism as a fanatical faith, almost like a cult bent on taking over the world. And so that really informs how we prosecute the Cold War. Yeah, it's nuclear, not nuclear, but be that as it may. What are? I'll let you look those up, in fact. Both of those ideas come out of President Eisenhower, who of course was a military guy, led the invasion at Normandy, and was the supreme Allied commander in Europe. But he comes up with these 2 ideas that are, at least the first one, military-industrial complex, is still with us. The domino theory, I'll talk about that one. It's the idea that just like if you set up a series of dominoes, you knock the first one over, the next one, they all fall over together. And that was used with the idea of if a country like Korea, like Vietnam, falls to communist rule, then potentially their neighbors like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, etc., that Indochina, Lower China area will also become communist. And it's not irrational at the time, because you look at both what the Soviets kept at the end of World War II all the way to the Elbe River, and all of a sudden now China becomes a communist country. So it does seem like the world's map is turning red, as we use that for kind of the descriptor of communism. So we end the war successfully, but if you remember back to the end of, the Soviets said at one of the conferences, I think it was Dumbarton, that, hey, when we defeat Germany, we'll come help you with Japan. And FDR and especially Truman was not really thrilled with that idea, but they do. And what we see in the post-war fallout is both the Korean and Vietnamese peninsulas are cut in half effectively. Korea at the 38th parallel, Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And now you have this competing interest within a singular country. And it starts with Korea, but we'll see it in Vietnam as well. It's known as a proxy war, and that's part of the reason the Cold War definition fits, is the US, USSR never went to war with each other, but we are fighting on either side of the ledger, either for democracy or for communism, through other countries, like Korea, like Vietnam. And so we'll do a quick, I kind of do it a disservice, I guess, but the Korean War. The Korean War also is unique in that it is the first time, really, the United States doesn't follow the Constitution as far as a declaration of war. That rests with the Congress. And then once that's made, now the president becomes commander-in-chief. But Truman, and with this new United Nations body behind him, he ends up kind of mincing words a bit. He calls it a police action. It's not a war. Therefore, he doesn't need Congress's approval. And guess what? We've seen that since Korea till the present, that all the time the president has put us into a war situation. Some of the time we'll go back and kind of after the fact get Congress to give it a thumbs up. But this especially comes to kind of a head in Vietnam, where Congress washes their hands of the whole situation and dumps it on Johnson, maybe because they saw what a quagmire it was going to become. So North Korean forces, communist forces supported by China and kind of tertiary support through the Soviet Union, invade across that 38th parallel. And for the beginning of the war, it doesn't look good. MacArthur's still there from World War II, so he ends up being the overall military commander. And Truman and MacArthur do not get along. Right? We're unable to conclude the hostilities, and you'll see when I show the maps where it ends up, basically back where it started. And then as soon as MacArthur comes out publicly telling Truman he's doing it wrong, man, you work for the commander-in-chief, so Truman fires MacArthur, and he kind of fades from the national stage at that point. So what happens? Well, the invasion, remember NSC 68 we just went over, the invasion by North Korea tends to confirm this idea that, hey man, the Soviets are bent on taking over the whole world. So that really cements the tenets of NSC 68 into our Cold War policy. And you notice the guy's name, Kim Il-sung, followed by Kim Jong-il, and now we have Kim Jong-un. So leadership of North Korea has been a family business since the 1950s. The 38th parallel comes about because that's where the line was drawn after World War II. So that's where the two are connected. And so the U.S. occupies, actually it should say south. I don't know why I put north. North is the North Korean side. Any other countries? Yeah, Vietnam. 33,000 American lives. It's called the Forgotten War, kind of because it was, in the shadow of World War II, where we had been flexing every aspect of national power. And this one not so much, and especially with the UN piece of it, we tended as a country not to focus on Korea as much. So let's step through the war, how it worked. So here you go, the start of coming across the 38th parallel. Seoul and Pyongyang are actually both fairly close to that border, which makes it interesting. But the communist forces, Kim Il-sung's forces, drive south and drive MacArthur, America, and UN forces into what's known as the Pusan perimeter. So they've got their backs to the South China Sea at this point. It's not looking very good. So MacArthur has to do one of two things, one of maybe three, I guess, and a naval evacuation, but that would have been problematic because the North did have ships that could sink ours. He could surrender. That wasn't going to happen. But what he ends up doing is coming with this breakout plan. So he pushes some of his forces north out of the perimeter, but he also does use the naval route to come in, and they call it the Incheon landing, in and behind the North Korean forces. And it surprises them, and you can see how those kind of come together in a pincer. And now we're able to, we the US UN forces, push back. And so all the way back up to the border with China, and here's kind of the fatal flaw, is once we go across the Yalu River, now all of a sudden we've got troops in, and a lot of it's just aircraft at the time, the advent of jet aircraft. But the Chinese get more involved because they don't like that move especially. And so what happens with their support is they push the US and UN forces back beyond the 38th parallel, but ultimately the war ends kind of where it started. And so that parallel becomes what's known as the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And here's what it looks like. So the idea is, one, it's a physical border, but it's also cleared out. Notice there's no trees, no nothing. So the idea is, well, if you're trying to mass forces, we're going to see you coming to preclude that. And that works for a while, but in the 90s, early 2000s, guess what? The North Koreans dig a series of tunnels underneath the DMZ, and here's a picture of one. And it was found out because of seismography. People, what are all these little earthquakes? Well, it was in fact explosions and digging these tunnels under the DMZ, and you can see where 3 of the 4 tunnels are focused. That would be Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Okay, but these were found out, and so they weren't used, but the potential was there to move trucks, troops. Some of them were even big enough to move small tanks through them. All right, so as we move into this era of 2 superpowers, both nuclear armed, how do you prosecute that? Because a war at this point could mean the extermination of the human race. And so this idea of brinksmanship, going right up to the brink, making your opponent think you're just crazy enough to try this, to try to win a nuclear war. And so by doing that, maybe you can push them to concessions or to do something you want. And we sort of see that in action in the Cuban Missile Crisis with President Kennedy. It's an evolution of an idea from a guy named John Nash, who develops this thing called game theory. And if you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, it's about Professor Nash, whose cheese was about 3/4 of the way off his cracker most of the time. But he was kind of one of those geniuses, and the idea of brinksmanship really permeates our Cold War policy. It's quantified in a thing called MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction, that if any one side lets nukes off the chain, that the other side's going to retaliate. It's game over for both. And so, as nutty as that sounds, it actually keeps us from going to war, a nuclear war at least, with the Soviet Union. This is a word I heard all the time on the news growing up. It's called détente. And it's a French word, but it means de-escalation. And the idea was that with what's at risk, not just the two superpowers, but the whole rest of the globe, that relaxing of tensions is always going to be a good thing between especially the two superpowers. So as we go through the 50s, Khrushchev, Eisenhower, I don't know that I'd say they had a great relationship, but Khrushchev was kind of actually popular in the U.S. He was kind of this old grandpa. He looks like Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. And he's over in the U.S. kind of trying to make nice a little bit, trying to execute this idea of détente. But what happens is a series of events, and the first one, probably most significant, is this shoot down of a U-2 spy plane. So we have spy planes over Russia. They have spies embedded in our society, but not so much the spy plane idea. And so when that gets shot down, the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was supposed to, all U-2 pilots had these, they had a cyanide capsule. You got shot down, you're supposed to eat that and kill yourself so you weren't interrogated. And he doesn't do that. So he's actually put on trial in the Soviet Union. And what happens is we have a Soviet spy in custody. And so they work out a deal, the two nations work out a deal to exchange the two. And that is the genesis of the book Bridge, or the movie Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. It's an okay movie. The Blue Star is the trailer for it. But it helps quantify in the movie, you see the actual building of the Berlin Wall and people being shot as they try to move from East to West Berlin to try to escape. Okay? So after the shoot down of the U-2, and oh, by the way, the U-2 is also instrumental at seeing the Cuban Missile Crisis developing. But the U.S., and this is before there were computers, develops a spy plane that can't be shot down. Why? Because it's so fast. It's actually faster than the anti-aircraft missiles being shot at it. And that's it. It's called the U-2. It's hypersonic, Mach 3 plus. They'll never really say what the total top speed was, but it went from New York to London in less than 2 hours. So it's pretty bloody fast. So that's our new, whereas the U-2 was a kind of a giant glider. It flew really high, but it was also really slow. And so there's a couple clips here if you want to watch them. One from a guy named Jeremy Clarkson on Top Gear. He was kind of a fanatic about the airplane. And it talks about some of the facts, like the plane sitting on the ground would leak fuel everywhere because it had to expand its 18 inches or so from the heat generator by going faster than a bullet. And so just some of the odd facts about it. And then there's a story about how fast it would go from one of the early SR-71 pilots. This was going on as well. And this is kind of the first wave of what I would call a mandatory medical program, vaccinations for polio. And, you know, it wasn't 100%, but 94, 95% of the country got the vaccine. And so it kind of reminds me of the current angst over COVID. This was much more, we're all in it together, it's contagious, and you know, you saw what it did with FDR. He had to walk with braces the rest of his life after catching it in his early 20s. So these are kids, and I was one of them. I think nuclear war can best be described as the ultimate expression of total war. That idea going all the way back to Sherman at the end of the Civil War, where it's not just war against the Confederate Army, it's war against the South. And so you involve the citizens, you make them feel the pain of war. And so certainly nuclear war, anything with that WMD kind of label would be total war, because you can't control how far it spreads. So we're going to add this to NSC 68. Not only are they fanatical, they're almost evil, satanic, this idea of communism. And so we develop a whole propaganda campaign against communism. Well, and guess what? They do the same against us. The capitalists are out to suck the blood of the workers. And so as we try to compete in this Cold War environment as the kinder, gentler superpower, things like this and things like our failure in Vietnam tend to turn off third world countries. We don't want to join the side of the U.S. Look what they did. Right? So it's kind of this psychological battle that's going on. So yeah, by doing that, you create anti-American revolutionaries, and a lot of them kind of pop up in Central America, right? Not just over in the Far East. So one of the pieces, if you think back, there was the U.S. Defense Act of 1947. I may be messing up the name of it. 1947, post-war. Truman signs this act, which does several things. It desegregates the military way ahead of the general civilian population. It makes a branch of the military, the Air Force, pulls airplanes effectively out of the Army, and it also brings up this group that hadn't existed yet called the CIA. The CIA, especially in its early years, is kind of out. It's doing U.S. policy, but we're starting to muck about in countries where we're either assassinating or overthrowing duly elected leaders. And one, especially a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, is going to come back to bite us twice. One with the Iranian hostage crisis, but that's a step on the way to 9/11. So here's a couple examples. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader of Vietnam. So a quick aside on Vietnam. Post-war, pre-war rather, Vietnam was a French colony. After the war, the French wanted to reestablish control of their colony. One of the things they got resource-wise was rubber from rubber trees. Big company, Michelin, French company. So they tried to, but are unable, because the French are pretty well decimated economically after World War II. So they asked the U.S. for help. And so we start to economically help the French. Then we basically take over the economic support for South Vietnam to resist communist expansion. And of course, eventually we end up with 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968. At the beginning of that whole chain of events, as the U.S. starts taking over the financial support, the communist leader Ho Chi Minh actually tries to court the U.S. to support him. He wants to unite the peninsula under his rule, but that rule would be a communist rule. And at that point, communism is a dirty word. So it just doesn't happen, and he kind of becomes the leader of the bad guys, the enemy side of that conflict. Yeah. So we put out the idea that we're going to help overthrow communism, but we really don't help. And we see that happen in a failed kind of coup attempt at a place called the Bay of Pigs in Canada, but we'll get to that. Okay. Khrushchev takes over from Stalin, who was the World War II leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev could be coarse or charming, and he was at times, right? There's a picture of. He doesn't want it to be such a us or them idea. It's more of a peaceful coexistence. At least that's how it starts. But then you go back to those events, the shoot down of the U-2, and then we see the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, peaceful coexistence, nice idea, but it doesn't really last very long. So there he is, holding a corn cob. He was visiting the U.S. This is a picture taken in Iowa on a goodwill tour, trying to mend some fences with the United States. But it's somewhat short-lived. And so that leads us to this idea. The picture is Mohammad Mossadegh. He was educated, at least part of his education was in Paris. He tended to dress very Western, and he was the duly elected leader of Iran after World War II ended in the early 1950s. Now, what happens is the U.S., the CIA, and the British equivalent, MI6, decide this guy is kind of dangerous. Well, why? Because at the time, the U.S. and British petroleum exporters were getting about 95% of the oil and profits from Iranian oil. Yes, they put in some investment in equipment, men, etc., but it was oil under the Iranian soil, so it really belonged to them. So Mossadegh doesn't like that financial arrangement. Why would he? And so he says, you know what? I'm going to nationalize. And that word means that the government's going to take over an industry. I'm going to nationalize Iranian oil, and we'll just split the profits 50-50. That was far too much for people used to getting 95% of the profit. And so the CIA and MI6 set up a coup to overthrow a very popular, duly elected, well-educated leader in Iran. One of the people involved with this coup attempt was a guy named Kermit Roosevelt, who was the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt and worked with the CIA. There were actually two coup attempts. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. The first one actually fails, and the CIA tells Roosevelt, hey, you need to get out of there. It didn't work, get out. And he doesn't listen. And they were able, on the second one, to undermine Mossadegh's authority. They started riots in the streets and effectively captured Mossadegh. He was supposed to be put to death. He was exiled from the country. And the U.S. then plugs in what we would call a puppet, right? Somebody that's going to do what we want them to do. And his name is Pahlavi. He's known as the Shah. It's kind of a title like king or emperor. He's the Shah of Iran, so he gets plugged in. And guess what? We're going to see the Shah of Iran as he flees because the people hate him because he was a brutal dictator in 1979 with the Iranian hostage crisis. Okay? Would this be kinder, gentler superpower? Well, not so much. And this whole operation was covered up through the early 2000s when a book by an ex-CIA operative written about it kind of leaks out. It wasn't supposed to. And it shows the Eisenhower and Winston Churchill even involved in this whole thing. Yeah, primarily we don't want to lose our grip on oil. BP, the current version of what was in Iran, is now BP, which you've heard of. Right? So 90-10, 95-5, there's different estimates on how much, but you can see the favor was toward the Western countries. And Mossadegh just wants a 50-50 break. And so here's the timeline for you. The CIA reinstates the Shah. His family had kind of run as a dictatorship the country. But in the early 50s, there was a democratic election that brought Mossadegh to power. And so once the Shah's plugged in, yeah, they give him a little bit, but we still get a 60-40 break on money, oil, and he's a U.S. puppet. He does our bidding throughout the 50s, 60s, and through the 70s, effectively. So there's a picture of him. He was very big into all the regalia, all the stuff that made him look like a big person. But he was brutal to his people, and especially his police force, called the Savak. Would crack down on any kind of, don't say anything bad about the Shah. Kind of a Putin-esque kind of guy, really. Right? So, at the time, one of the things we used against Mossadegh is we called him, hey, he's leaning toward communism. And that's all it takes, man. Stick a communist sticker on somebody, and we're going to do something about it. Okay? Yeah, that last bullet. Once he's in power, he leans on the U.S. for support throughout his dictatorship. The unintended consequences, I talked about the Savak. The Shah lives, very well. Hell, he had lunches flown in on the Concorde from Paris, right, while the rest of his people are starving. And so as he loses grip, as the people start to rebel against him, he also falls ill with cancer. He kind of bebops around Africa, Europe, but eventually ends up landing in the United States. Jimmy Carter does not want to let him come into the country, but he does finally. He's convinced to do that. And so when the Shah lands here for medical treatment, the Iranians, this explodes in Iran. And that's what causes the Iranians to attack the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and take ultimately what comes down to 52 hostages for 444 days. So perhaps Jimmy Carter was right, but but because we do let them land here, it backfires on us, and it really spells the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency because he can do nothing about it. So with this idea of, we come out of the 50s kind of economically doing very well, but the country is sort of constrained socially. You have kind of the white shirt, black pants, black tie uniform for most all the men. This idea of conformity, the kind of post-World War II propaganda campaign to get women out of the factories where Rosie the Riveter and her gang are helping support the war effort. But now that the war's over and the boys are coming home, well, we got to get them out of there to let the boys go back to work. So that, this Leave It to Beaver kind of TV family is developing some resentment, and we see that explode in the counterculture. But the beginnings of this changing of the guard ideas, when we go from Eisenhower, kind of older, drab, to a very young, dynamic President Kennedy with wife Jacqueline and 2 little kids running around the White House lawn. So it's a big change. Right? Kennedy, the first Catholic president ever elected, the second being Joe Biden. Because there's always been this kind of U.S. fear of, are Catholics more loyal to the Pope or to the country? But Kennedy's popular enough, and I'll explain why part of that comes about, that he wins the nomination, ultimately wins the presidency. As he takes office, there's this idea that there's a missile gap between us and the Soviets. It's not real, but that helps build on this arms race that develops. So both countries start building up nuclear arsenals, to the point that we have 2, 3, 4 times enough missiles to blow the world up. How many missiles do you need? And at this point, we plug in the 22nd Amendment. So would Eisenhower have run? If he did, would he have won? It's an imponderable, but that's irrelevant now. There are no third terms. 2 terms is it. And so now the Republicans nominate Nixon, who is his vice president, Eisenhower's vice president for both terms. So it's Nixon versus Kennedy. And at this point, we have the advent of almost every house in America has a TV. And so the first presidential debates to be televised are going to be the Nixon-Kennedy debates. The Blue Star videos, I actually use these in class, not just for history, but for all of my classes. It's a clip that shows how a debate should work, let's put it that way. They ask each other questions. Nixon at one point says, I agree with Mr. Kennedy on this, this, and this. They were respectful. They didn't interrupt. They listened to each other. And to me, the actual polar opposite of that was the interruption fest that was the 2020 debate. I can't even call it a debate. It was political theater in the worst sense. So that's what the first video is. The second one really explains some of the background of the Kennedy team. Just like FDR and Hitler figured out this new medium of radio to communicate with the people, Kennedy's team figures out that TV is the key. The Obama team figured out that the internet was the key. The Trump team figured out that social media was the key. So there's always been this evolution of how to communicate, and Kennedy gets it. Nixon really doesn't. And one of the things you look at, this was the second debate, so you can see they're not even co-located. But the first one, they were in the same room, and they sat and they were respectful. But the Kennedy team figured out the set for the debate, and most people had black and white TVs at this point, but they dressed him in blue colors that made him stand out from kind of the gray background, where Nixon kind of blended in. Nixon had been on the campaign trail, so he was tired. He was recovering from the flu. He did something to his knee, so he was always shifting his weight around, and he tended to sweat under the lights of the camera. So Kennedy looked, fit, glowing, contrasting with the background. Nixon sweating, shifting his weight. He looked shifty. And so this visual really helps Kennedy win the presidency. And it wasn't a landslide by any means. The electoral vote, yes. But we see 2 things happen. The popular vote, Kennedy wins, but not by much. We see a division here. If we look at Mississippi and half of Alabama, the Alabama piece is not supposed to happen. Those are faithless electors. But the Mississippi piece, they cast all 8 of their electoral votes for this other, and the guy's name was Harry Byrd. And this is the very beginnings of what we're going to see with George Wallace and a white supremacist platform in 1968, where he actually takes 5 or 6 states in the Electoral College. And that's the beginnings of this. Two keys to Kennedy's victory. One was he didn't lose the South entirely. And the second is, who was his vice president? Lyndon Johnson. Where was he from? Texas. So that really put Kennedy kind of over the top. It was assumed that he would take, being from Boston, he would take the New England states, but he didn't take all of them. So that's enough. And that's why when you pick a presidential ticket, you pick somebody maybe with different experience or from a different geographical and heavy-hitting electoral college state to put as your vice president, because that can help. So Biden, Delaware, Kamala Harris, California. So there's JFK and Jackie, right? Kind of a young, vibrant couple. Kennedy was a World War II veteran, and he had he was in a very severe accident with a PT boat that he was on, and his back never quit hurting him after the war. But he kind of covered it pretty well. There's the kids playing in the Oval Office and out on the White House lawn. So very different than your Eisenhower, Truman, FDR, the kind of old white dudes program. So on his foreign policy, he wants to develop something more flexible than just we've got peace and we've got nuclear war and there's nothing in between. And so Kennedy's a very strong proponent of special forces, small covert groups that go out and do their thing. He's naive a bit early on as president, and he allows the CIA to talk him into doing this invasion at the Bay of Pigs, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But he wanted to strengthen alliances. He really wanted to be the kinder, gentler superpower. So as an example, he develops the Peace Corps and USAID, things like that, to go out and help these developing countries, not to try to twist their arm, but to show, hey, this is what we can do, and make them naturally want to come to our side of this bipolar Cold War world. Okay? And there's one of these allies that, believe it or not, initially was a U.S. ally. The Batista government of Cuba was strongly allied with the U.S. Cuba, especially Havana, was a big tourist location. They had casinos, bars, restaurants, etc. But the Batista government is overthrown by a guy named Fidel Castro. And the U.S. initially tries to kind of court Castro, but we give him the stiff arm, just like we do Ho Chi Minh, because he's a, say it, communist. Right? So he seeks support from the Soviet Union, and when the Bay of Pigs happens, it pushes him even deeper into the Soviet camp. So let's talk about this Bay of Pigs. There's a picture of Castro, right, the takeover. And the assumption in the U.S. was he wasn't very popular, when in fact he actually was, because the Batista government was fairly corrupt. And so here we go. The CIA says, you know what, some of these exiles that fled when Castro took over, let's get them all in a group. Let's arm them, and let's let them invade. We'll support them and overthrow Castro, and Cuba will go back to what it was before. Okay, that's the plan. Now let's see how the plan works. Picture 1, planning. That looks good. Picture 2, disaster. They're all caught, all but like 8 of them. Right, so it doesn't go as planned. So that first step is a disaster. But let's hold that thought, because Kennedy is less, what's the word? He's more suspicious now of advice he gets from the CIA and the military. And that actually pays dividends in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff that said, let's just bomb Cuba into the Stone Age with nukes. And Kennedy pushes back on that idea. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, promised support from the U.S. In fact, there were U.S. aircraft carriers out in the water that these exiles could see. So they're assuming, yep, the U.S. is going to live up to their word. People would rise up, the army would crumble, Castro would flee, all will be well. Okay, so these exiles go in, and the U.S., they do see airplanes launching off the carriers, but all they're doing is keeping an eye on the situation. They're not actually helping, so they get no U.S. support. And, of course, they're captured. Here's the problem. Bad intel. People happy, army integrated into the government, so it was sort of doomed from the beginning because of the bad intel. It made Castro more popular, drove him more deeply into the Soviet camp, more Soviet support, to include now we're going to put short and medium range missiles, the Soviets are, on the island of Cuba. Ooh, that doesn't sound good. And Castro, probably till his dying day, was always worried about the U.S. coming back and trying to invade. So here's a meeting of young, new President Kennedy with Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev sums up Kennedy in his mind as being young, inexperienced, naive, and being able to be pushed around, especially via brinksmanship. And he's probably right at the beginning. But that first misstep, I mean, the Kennedy administration, all of a sudden, first out of the gate is the Bay of Pigs. Not good. But I think it taught Kennedy a strong lesson. And so we're going to see that come back in this Cuban Missile Crisis. In this time frame as well, remember we're supposed to be doing détente kind of things, de-escalating. But you see not just a missile race, but a military, just a fielded military, men and equipment race develop. The Berlin Wall goes up to physically divide the city of Berlin back from the World War II divisions. Soviets spending more on defense, U.S. spending more on defense. And look, the Berlin Wall, that physical thing, if you have to build a wall to keep your people in your country, you're probably doing it wrong. And there's some spectacular stories about people building hot air balloons out of sheets to fly over the Berlin Wall to get out of East Berlin and get to the west. Right? But if you just ran across, you were probably going to be shot because there were guard towers all along this wall. And of course, it finally falls as the Soviet Union collapses in the late 80s, early 90s. So this is not détente, and neither is this. And you miss it by being, online. But we did I give the class an intel packet that shows the location of the missiles. There's a whole armada of ships coming across the ocean loaded with more missiles and nuclear material from the Soviet Union. And so I give them, here's the situation. What do you do, President Kennedy? And they generally come up with some good answers. But here's what he did. That's him talking to his brother Bobby, the Attorney General. And here are, that's always an option, I guess, do nothing. But that was untenable. And one, how do we know that the Soviets have put missiles there? Because of U-2 spy plane flights over Cuba. It's like, holy moly. Short and medium range missiles can reach Washington, D.C. from Cuba. We can try diplomacy, and we do a piece of number 2. Yes, that was out there, just a conventional invasion. But we tried that once. It didn't work so good. We could blockade Cuba. The word blockade is an act of war, right? And so Kennedy uses part of number 4, but he changes the word from blockade to quarantine. Does it make any difference? No, it's doing the same thing, but the word itself is important, and it works. Yes, we could bomb that. Yes, we could nuke, turn Cuba into a glass parking lot. So ultimately what he does is negotiate, says, hey, Khrushchev, get your missiles out of Cuba, and in return U.S. will, dogs, get our missiles out of Turkey. That is done behind the scenes. The Soviet piece, getting out of Cuba, is more publicly seen. And so it looks like Cuba, or the Soviets, kind of blink in this brinksmanship game, whereas we offered, another side a little tit for tat on that. The other piece was, he said, I'm going to quarantine the island of Cuba. I'm going to set up a naval blockade and stop all these incoming ships. And so that was kind of the very critical point. What do the Soviet ships do when they reach this quarantine, this blockade? And they ended up turning around. And so the world was on the precipice. And, talking to people, my parents remember this pretty well, in that everybody was on edge. It was a week of back and forth. Are we going to go to, World War III with the Soviets? And so my head's blocking it. This is a speech Kennedy gave to the American public about what was going on. And I asked the question well, why would he do that? Doesn't that make people nervous? Well, it could, but I think Kennedy, 1, wanted to be honest with what was going on, and 2, he wanted to put out that we were not the aggressors, it was the Soviets, in the court of public opinion. Because remember, now we have TV. So he broadcast it to the United States, but the whole world saw him. And one of the things he says in that speech is, any missile launched from the island of Cuba on any country in the Western Hemisphere, going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine, will be seen as an act of war by the Soviet Union on the United States and will precipitate a full retaliatory response. Oof. That's brinksmanship in a nutshell. Would we have done it? I don't know. It's an imponderable, but it worked. Because had that happened, we'd have had World War III, and likely we wouldn't be talking right now. One of the things that comes out of this crisis as well Yep, here's the removal of the missiles. I already talked about that. It does weaken Cuban-Soviet relations, but it doesn't pull the Cubans out of the Soviet camp. Kennedy is really gaining his footing now as a national and international leader, so much to the point that he goes to Berlin to give a speech and talk about the differences between, look at the West, look at the East, look at the difference between communism and capitalism and democracy. And it's hugely received in Berlin. That is the other thing that comes out of it, that because the events were spinning so quickly, that the decisions were actually behind the communications. So they install, you call it the red phone, but it's a direct link from the president to the Soviet premier, so that things don't get out of hand in the future. They can call and directly talk to each other anytime, all the time. Right? Some more of the fallout. Whoops. And then, of course, Kennedy, now that he is really his own man, his own presidency, he starts to campaign for the re-election in 1964. So as part of that campaign, he goes to Dallas, is riding in this limousine with the governor of Texas. They come around the corner, and Lee Harvey Oswald gets a couple shots off. The first video, sometimes they take this down, but if you go to YouTube and Google the Zapruder film, there was this guy, it's Ephraim Zapruder. He had a little 8mm camera like they used to have back in the day, and it's a silent video, but he captures the moment of the first bullet hits Kennedy, goes through his shoulder, and you see him kind of lean forward, and Jackie sitting next to him looks over and sees something's wrong. He starts to see blood on him, so she climbs over, and right about then, bam, the second bullet, I mean, it's gory. Basically his head explodes from the second shot. So the Secret Service jump on the back of the limousine. They speed off to the hospital, and the first word gets broadcast, and that's this third blue star. And this is really good. The president has been shot, and he's not doing well, but he's not dead. And then a few minutes later, Walter Cronkite comes on, and he announces that the president is dead. And back then, newsmen weren't supposed to show emotion. That was off limits. But Walter Cronkite, the consummate newsman, he's barely holding it in. Kennedy was a very popular president, and so he almost breaks down in tears when this happens. And this is a 9/11 moment, really. Everybody who was alive with a memory at that point remembers where they were when they heard Kennedy had been assassinated. Hey. So a few more pictures. Of course, at that point now, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, is sworn in on Air Force One. You can see Jackie standing right next to him, still wearing the same outfit, covered in Kennedy's blood. And now he's in charge. Two blue stars. One is a trailer for a movie with Bryan Cranston as LBJ. He's really good. But it shows Johnson, a Texas Democrat, but he really picks up the football that Kennedy had started moving on both civil rights and voting rights. And so he continues pushing that forward, the Kennedy program. And on the second one, it's more of a poem than a song, but it's by Bob Dylan, Murder Most Foul. And it relates to the Kennedy assassination. Thousands were watching, no one saw a thing. And this is the funeral. The caissons go by with the casket draped in the American flag, and little Jack standing there sees everybody else, all the soldiers saluting, so he does the same. It's a pretty tear-jerking photo, right? And there is a video, it's hidden behind right there, the story behind the picture. You can see Jackie dressed in black. Problem is, they capture Lee Harvey Oswald, but this strip club owner from Dallas decides that he's so angry with Oswald that he goes in as they're moving him out of the jail and shoots him right in the chest and kills Oswald. So we don't get any of the details, the motivation, the why behind the assassination, and that really promotes these kind of ridiculous conspiracy theories that you hear about Kennedy. All right, let's keep driving a little bit quicker here. Some pictures from, as we move from the Kennedy to the Johnson, we're going to see protests develop more and more and more. There's three movements: the civil rights, the women's rights, and the anti-Vietnam War protests. And they all connect on the fringes. It's a dislike of society in general and a protest against it. And so you see this is a riot that happens in Chicago outside the Democratic National Convention. Obviously civil rights primarily in the South, but not exclusively. This guy who looks like a young Nicolas Cage is burning his draft card in protest. And again, this is in Chicago, and you can see the hippies, if you will, putting flowers in the end of the rifles of the National Guard. And that's a very iconic picture of the time. The two kind of pieces of society, the authority versus those protesting against it. And so just one word of the day and then some alphabet soup, which is really there just so you don't get confused. Desegregation, right? The country had been segregated since Plessy versus Ferguson, and the idea of separate but equal, which led to the Jim Crow laws that govern the country. And we're going to see a breaking down of those, a desegregating, starting with education. Here's your alphabet soup. And these are some of the groups supporting either civil rights or women's rights or both. And really, if you look at Martin Luther King, one, he was a great orator, but he was also able to get all of these groups to put aside their own kind of special interest, their reason for being, and work for the betterment of all. And maybe that was his genius, is getting them all to work together. This one kind of sticks out. One of these is not like the other. The NLF, National Liberation Front. We know them as the Viet Cong, or the VC. They're the communist supporting guerrilla fighters in the Vietnam War. We have the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, regular army, but the VC, the Viet Cong, support that mission, and that's who they are. Yeah, alphabet soup, right? All right, so I talked about this, that this puts Plessy versus Ferguson, puts separate but equal in the context of constitutionality. And the videos, if you haven't seen it, if you have, you can skip them. But the movie 42, one of the first things was the military desegregated, and then baseball. Not desegregated, but the idea of the Brooklyn Dodgers saying, this guy can play. We want him on our team. And the grace, I think is the word, that Jackie Robinson showed in all that he took. Being the first at anything, the first one through the wall, gets bloodied. And he was, called everything under the sun. Right? Most hit by pitch, most slid into and spiked in the leg. But he plays well enough that a lot of people are like, dude, you got the goods, we want you on the field. Okay? So it's part of the winds of change. But it's still, at this point, remember, we go all the way back to the post-Civil War, 13, 14, 15th Amendment right to vote, and yet only about 20% of blacks, especially in the South, had registered to vote. Because of what? Well, poll taxes and grandfather clauses and just terrorism by the KKK. So there's going to be a movement in the 60s to push to get blacks to register to vote. It's called the Freedom Summer of 1964, and I was about 4 months old. Right? The question is, where does segregation exist? What elements? Let's just look at a map and it shows you. Most people think of education. A lot of them think about public facilities, rightly so, right? Movie theaters, water fountains, etc. Public transportation, we're going to see that with the Freedom Rides on Greyhound buses, and prisons as well. And it's primarily concentrated in the old Confederacy, but not exclusively. There's still elements of segregation throughout the country. Growing up in Ohio, I just didn't see it. And here's an example. If in Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea of separate but equal, if you didn't have something that was separate but equal, you had to allow for someone to come in this case the 61-year-old trying to get his PhD, and yet dressed well but still shoved off to the side, not allowed in the classroom with the rest of the students. So I like that picture as a demonstration of what segregation meant. Okay, so it comes to the courts, and this, as famous as, maybe more so than Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education starts to break down segregation, and it comes to a head in Little Rock. We'll look at some pictures there. So anytime there's a Supreme Court decision, the majority, and I want to say this was 7-1 with one abstention, so it was a pretty significant majority in the court, said segregation does not mean equal. Right? You can see his wording right there. It deprives children of minority groups educational opportunities. Yes. And he says it's inherently unequal. So thus ends the Jim Crow laws. And on top of this, you see protests from like Rosa Parks, back of the bus. Whoops. And Martin Luther King talking about, we're tired of being flung across the abyss of humiliation. Treat us like people, for God's sake. Okay? So here's kind of a list. It's a lot of words, but it kind of describes what was going on. As this Brown versus Board of Education is looming, a bunch of Southern congressmen sign what they call the Southern Manifesto and says, we're not going to comply. We're not going to follow a ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States. And so you can see there's resistance to this idea already. And so Eisenhower, look, he should have not said this, I think, that you can't change people's hearts. Well, you enforce the law, dude. That's what you do. And so they are going to start to desegregate Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. And so 9 students are going to enter that school in the fall. And of course the governor's like, nope, I'm going to call out the National Guard and we're going to block them. Okay, and so Eisenhower here finally gets kind of his mind in order, and he says, okay, I'll see you the National Guard and raise you the 101st Airborne. And so he has them escort what become known as the Little Rock Nine into school. And can you imagine yourself, a young student wanting to go to school, being escorted by an airborne soldier with a bayonet to get into school? But maybe Favis, the governor, had the last word. He closed the schools. Okay, you enforce it, I'm closing the school system. And it becomes really the lost year of school for these folks. So there's a iconic picture of the Little Rock Nine. And then the reaction 2. And there was a PBS special a few years ago where they actually tracked down this lady, and you can see she is not pleased with the situation, and they interviewed her, and she was like, man, I am embarrassed at how I acted. I shouldn't have done that. But you can see the crowd not too thrilled. And imagine just being this poor girl. All that angst. And Jackie Robinson saw it, and so many others did. A guy named Meredith saw it. James Meredith, a veteran, wants to get his master's degree at Ole Miss. And in this case, now we got to send 500 federal marshals to keep the guy from getting killed. Just trying to get an education, and a veteran who served his country. Okay? So he does make it through and graduate, but this was the reception he saw. Welcome to Ole Miss. Frat boys. I talked about this briefly, and I want to speed up a little bit. I'm going to be in an hour. There's 2 things. The Freedom Rides in '61, and they purposely flaunt the laws of segregation on public transport. So you have black and white riders on Greyhound buses. They start in the north, they go into southern cities on purpose to generate TV moments effectively. Look at what's going on, right? The violence, let's just look at a couple pictures. Here's where they started, typically in the north, Washington, Newark, New Jersey, New York, and drove down into various cities. There you see Chattanooga, Charlotte. And these little asterisks on the map means violence associated with the trip. And notice most all of them are focused on Jackson, Mississippi. And they were doing that on purpose to show that they're peacefully riding on a bus and getting their butts kicked by law enforcement. And you can see how many, 306 go to jail. So they kind of flood the jails and overwhelm the system to make their point. But it wasn't without danger, because you can see here's the bus leaving Newark. But look, black and white riders both were very much in danger. That guy, beaten within an inch of his life. And finally, the Greyhound bus company's like, yeah, enough of this, man. We're not getting our buses keep getting burnt to the ground. We're going to stop supporting it. And so that ends this Freedom Rides. Now we fast forward a bit to Freedom Summer, which was 1964. And remember, you saw the 20% of blacks registered to vote. So there's this push by kind of idealistic northern college students to go into the South to help blacks register to vote, just helping them with the process. And so these 3 young men go into Mississippi and disappear. Okay, so the FBI is now involved, and it's a movie, and it's not really pleasant, but it captures the times. It's called Mississippi Burning, and so they look for these kids, and they finally the case gets broken by the sheriff's wife because she's sick of all the racism, and she tells the FBI where the three boys they were shot and buried in an earthen dam, and they finally find them. They were, just an aside, all three of them awarded the Congressional Medal of Freedom, which is like the Medal of Honor in the military by President Obama. Right? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, look at the crowd. Again, this speech resonates in people's minds because King goes back to that repertory phrase, I have a dream. But I copied one of my favorite lines from it down there at the bottom, right? And I still like that. Judged by the content of their character. Just think where we'd be today if that really was taken to heart back in 1963. So, the football that Kennedy started moving forward is picked up and eventually signed. And look who's in the background in the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Right? That's not by accident. So Lyndon Johnson does both of these, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, in rapid succession. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, we talked about kind of the build-up too, so I'm going to skip through these. But in the South, the Kennedy administration, we've gone from helping the French to helping the South Vietnamese monetarily ourselves. Now we're actually going to put boots on the ground. And Kennedy puts in about 400 special forces into South Vietnam to help train the Vietnamese. But we see that number grow, and after 1964 and a thing called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson explodes the numbers. We're up to 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968. In this kind of build-up period, Diem, the South Vietnamese leader, was unpopular. Even the Kennedy administration didn't like him. And guess what? They get wind of a coup that's coming to take Diem out. And since they don't like him either, they don't let him know. And guess what? He's assassinated. And Kennedy knew it was coming. And that generates a lot of political chaos in South Vietnam, which brings us in even more. So this post-war idea, there was three potential ways to divide the country. Ho Chi Minh in the north wanted it here, down, almost down to Saigon. The French wanted it way up there because both sides want more of the country. So that's where the 17th parallel comes in. It's kind of a split right down the middle of the country. It's just like a line drawn. But you can see on this map the black, the Viet Minh, that's what's going to become the Viet Cong. And they're everywhere. It's not localized north and south. So that's problematic. The U.S. doesn't even sign the accord, and we don't even support the elections that were supposed to happen 2 years later. So from the very beginning, we're kind of playing both sides. So there's a picture of Ho Chi Minh. And it becomes Johnson's War. And that's what we're going to wrap up with here. This idea of the domino theory was widely accepted, that if Vietnam falls, then so will Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And so he starts to build up and uses this incident in the Gulf of Tonkin to really escalate our entry into the war. And here's what it was. The so-called events were these ships were fired upon by North Vietnamese. Well, actually, yes, they were. We were kind of at a quasi-war, I guess you'd say at that point. But we attacked and sank North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. So the whole thing was really fabricated, exaggerated to support Johnson's expansion of the Vietnam War. And it did. Okay, so after the fact, they go back and look at the NSA looks at what happened. And it was all kind of BS. But that's what was sold to the American public as a reason to plus up our troop strength. So here's what happens, and the bold part is what really should grab your attention. Congress says, Mr. President, do what you need. Right? I'm paraphrasing it. Congress washes their hands of their authority to declare war, and they hand it over to the president. And they say, guess what? You tell us when those goals have been met. Okay, and so Johnson takes the ball and runs with it, and now we're going to see up to 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So it is Mr. Johnson's war. Okay, We do all kinds of kind of nefarious things. Supplies running down in this triple canopy jungle. You can't see the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we use this thing called Agent Orange to kill all the plant life so that we can bomb and interdict supplies coming down. Bad news is that stuff's like Roundup times 20. So all the people that dealt with it, handled it, used it, sprayed it, almost all of them died of cancer. Okay? And then I'm going to save that for the next one. That's the turning point in the Vietnam War. All of this building up, Johnson saying, we are winning. We're kicking butt over there. And all of a sudden this offensive happens and the U.S. goes, wait a minute. You told us we were winning. How could this happen? Because the Tet Offensive is an offensive by the North Vietnamese. Right? So that kind of ends this era. It's like the country's coming unglued. If you talk about peace and togetherness like the Kennedys, like JFK or MLK, it's like you get assassinated, right? And the cities themselves are exploding, both from the assassination of King, but just from angst in general. So if you look at this list, most of the cities are in the north, and you would expect it to have been the opposite, especially after King's assassination. So there's your kind of laundry list. Malcolm Little, also known as Malcolm X, and then comes the Tet Offensive, the My Lai Massacre, resistance to the draft, the Democratic Convention. It's like, oh my God. And so that's the last clip. It shows the police literally beating the tar out of peaceful protesters outside the Democratic Convention in '68. Okay. Let's, I'll just put them up here. Here's the pieces of. Johnson had this idea of making the country better, a war on poverty, and so these are the pieces of that. And some still around today, right? Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the impoverished, the PBS still around, environmental acts, etc. Okay, but a lot of people said that's way too much. That's socialism, dude. So I went over an hour. Yikes, that's a lot of stuff to cover. I mean, the '60s, you'd spend 4 years studying them, right? But that's kind of your quick overview. So I'll close this, and I'll jump on chapter 30 here sometime this evening. Get that to you.